Christianity before Christ. If you've always felt that church Christianity seems somehow lacking in depth of thought and sense of wonder, then this is the episode for you. I'm a firm believer that church Christianity is only the tip of the iceberg of a much earlier, internally focused and transformational kind of philosophy than what we have access to today. So I'd like to begin this study with a reading from P.D. Ouspensky's amazing book, In Search of the Miraculous. And this is Gurdjieff speaking on the subject. He says, generally speaking, we know very little about Christianity and the form of Christian worship. We know nothing at all of the history and origin of a number of things. For instance, the church, the temple in which gather the faithful and in which services are carried out according to special rites. Where was this taken from? Many people do not think about this at all. Many people think that the outward form of worship, the rites, the singing of canticles, and so on, were invented by the fathers of the church. Others think that this outward form has been taken partly from pagan religions and partly from the Hebrews. But all of it is untrue. The question of the origin of the Christian church, that is, the Christian temple, is much more interesting than we think. To begin with, the church and worship in the form which they took in the first centuries of Christianity could not have been borrowed from paganism, because there was nothing like it, either in the Greek or Roman cults or in Judaism. The Jewish synagogue, the Jewish temple, Greek and Roman temples of various gods were something quite different from the Christian church, which made its appearance in the first and second centuries. The Christian church is a school concerning which people have forgotten that it is a school. Imagine a school where the teachers give lectures and perform explanatory demonstrations without knowing that these are lectures and demonstrations, and where the pupils, or simply the people who come to the school, take these lectures and demonstrations for ceremonies, or rites, or sacraments. In other words, magic. This would approximate to the Christian church of our times. The Christian church, the Christian form of worship, was not invented by the fathers of the church. It was all taken in a ready-made form from Egypt. Only not from the Egypt that we know, but from one which we do not know. This Egypt was in the same place as the other, but it existed much earlier. Only small bits of it survived in historical times, and these bits have been preserved in secret, and so well that we do not even know where they have been preserved. It will seem strange to many people when I say that this prehistoric Egypt was Christian many thousands of years before the birth of Christ. That is to say, its religion was composed of the same principles and ideas that constitute true Christianity. Special schools existed in this prehistoric Egypt, which were called schools of repetition. In these schools, a public repetition was given on definite days, and in some schools, perhaps even every day, of the entire course in a condensed form of the sciences that could be learned at these schools. Sometimes this repetition lasted a week or a month. Thanks to these repetitions, people who had passed through this course did not lose their connection with the school and retained in their memory all they had learned. Sometimes they came from very far away, simply in order to listen to the repetition, and went away feeling their connection with the school. There were special days of the year when the repetitions were particularly complete, when they were carried out with particular solemnity, and these days themselves possessed a symbolical meaning. These schools of repetition were taken as a model for Christian churches. The form of worship in Christian churches almost entirely represents the course of repetition of the sciences dealing with the universe and man. Individual prayers, hymns, responses, all have their own meaning in this repetition, as well as holidays and all religious symbols, though their meaning has been forgotten long ago. All of this very much jives with what we know about where and when the first churches arose, especially Coptic Christianity in Egypt, which was the main religion in Egypt from the 4th century up until conquest by Muslims in the 7th century. And even then the Coptics were the majority, as the Muslims were only a ruling elite, getting progressively richer and richer off collecting their Islamic jizya tax from the indigenous Coptic Egyptian population. Somewhere around the 14th century, Islam finally became a majority religion in Egypt, and so you've got to consider that's been for a very long time. In addition to Gurdjieff, other early thinkers like Blavatsky, MacGregor Mathers looked to Egypt for earlier elements of Christianity, as did 19th and 20th century Egyptologists like Budge or de Lubitz. Think about it. This is the era when Egypt was being rediscovered. But now hardly anyone dare go there. Western church Christianity, of course, wants to keep it all looking Western, so try to paint the ancient Egyptians as primitive, animal-worshipping pagans. And contemporary Egyptologists must maintain their baseline of academic atheism, so they won't go down this route so as to avoid lending any historical credence to anything that might have been Christian. But perhaps some of the most compelling evidence for Christianity before Christ coming out of Egypt comes right out of the Bible. The main patriarchs of the Old Testament, even Jesus himself, all spent time in ancient Egypt. And they didn't just pass on through, they settled, interacted. Some even got jobs. Certainly, all were there long enough to learn something about Egyptian culture and Egyptian religion of the time. So here's the list of the biblical patriarchs who went into Egypt. In the Old Testament, we have the patriarchs, Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph, as well as Moses. Abraham went into Egypt during a famine in Canaan. This is in Genesis chapter 12. And he stayed there long enough to get a job, carry out a long-term deception about his wife really being his sister in order to court Pharaoh's favor. As a result of this, he gains material wealth and a lesson on truth rather than deceit to get by. Joseph in Genesis chapter 37, the famous coat of many colors, or Technicolor Dreamcoat, as I like to remember, was sold into slavery in Egypt by his brothers at the age of 17, and then stayed there his whole life due to his ability to always maintain a positive attitude in his interactions. He eventually works his way out of slavery, gains favor interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, and eventually rises to a governor-type position. Some believe that he even started the family line, which eventually led to the birth of Moses, but we'll get to Moses in a minute. But it's Joseph's faith and consistency in his behavior that leads to his success. He finds happiness by remembering to be happy. So then Jacob, Joseph's father, moves to Egypt at Joseph's offering during a famine. Prior to this, he'd been deceived by his other sons to believe that Joseph was dead. So for Jacob, he gets a sort of death before life experience, which ties in with the idea that we must die before we can be born. And then, of course, you have Moses. Everyone knows Moses came from Egypt and, in fact, spent his early life on the inside of Egyptian royalty and priesthoods, and therefore, most certainly would have been well educated in all the Egyptian philosophy and religion available at the time. And Moses is the one who wrote the book of Genesis, they believe, which identifies the Egyptian connections with Abraham, Joseph, and Jacob. And since Moses was the author or transcriptionist, depending on how you look at it, it may have been him who gave Jacob the title Israel, which some believe is really a combination of three Egyptian words, Is, Ra, and El. Is, Isis, the divine mother, feminine, lunar yin current. Ra, or Re, the divine father, masculine, solar yang current. And then El, the divine embodiment of God the Absolute, the divine spark that resides in all beings. Now, flipping over to the New Testament, you find first in the book of Acts 7:22 says, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action, lending credence to everything he subsequently might have written about the patriarchs and their Egyptian influences. And finally, you've got Jesus himself, who we read in Matthew chapter 2 that Jesus was taken into Egypt by his parents not long after his birth, shortly after the visit by the three Magi, possibly around the age of 2 or 3. And then the whole narrative skips to Jesus reappearing in Nazareth, grown up, and revealing this teaching that is already whole and complete. Now, it's fuzzy how long he was there. There's different clues in some of the apocryphal books like Gospel of Thomas, but just based on what the biblical Gospels say, he must have been there at least a decade or so. And how could anyone spend that much time in ancient Egypt at such a formative age and not absorb some of the essence of the cultural beliefs and attitudes, if not direct teachings? Now, the church, Christianity, responds to how Jesus could show up, just appear in Nazareth with a that is whole and complete, is that, well, he's the divine incarnation of God. He just knows. And so this perspective endeavors to simply wipe away the idea of oral tradition or of learning or of that Jesus was in a human form for a reason and may have possibly learned things over his lifetime. So even in Sanatana Dharma, many of the avatars aren't really aware of their divine nature, cognizant of it, and go through life learning things and growing up. This is certainly the case with Hanuman. I believe to some extent Ram is like this in the Ramayana. He's acting for most of the initial parts of it as a prince, and he's going through life and learning all kinds of lessons. So I don't think that you have to completely dispense with divinity if you don't accept that a messenger from beyond doesn't himself go through an earthly process of interacting with the universe that he has been reborn into. This is certainly the idea with the fallen angel or the Fravashi in Zoroastrianism, that that the divine essence needs to fall into material creation or to carnal existence in order to go through this sort of lesson of eventually again becoming divine. So take from all of this what you will. Take from all of this what you will. I'm not saying I know what's going on, but just a little bit of digging reveals just how much of the truth is actually being covered up by mainstream church Christianity. And I find myself amazed the more I actually take time to study what is in the Bible, how much of this is actually still in there, perhaps only in a seed form, but the seeds are in there, the sparks are in there for you to take and see what grows from there. And again, if you take the Bible as being, it's just a historical document and it's all literal truth and none of it is to be questioned and none of it is to be reflected upon, then and you'll arrive at the sort of conclusions that church Christianity wants everyone to arrive at. But if you take the seeds, you take the elements of it, the pieces of it that resonate, that draw in your interest, and just allow it to foment, just chew on it, just allow it to absorb, it might turn into something else. The truth might be out there, but you have to start looking in here.